My family said I failed the army. I never argued. But every morning I still wake up hearing their judgment carved into the silence of my own mind. I'm sitting outside a federal military tribunal at Camp Pendleton watching Marines in dress blues file past like they're walking into church. The California sun beats down on concrete steps that have seen 1,000 verdicts, 1,000 careers ended with the slam of a gavel. I'm in civilian clothes. A simple navy blouse, gray slacks, flats that don't click when I walk. Nothing that draws attention, nothing that screams for validation. My sister Jessica is inside facing a formal misconduct hearing. Something about unauthorized intel, routing my mother said on the phone. Probably nothing she added like she was convincing herself. I didn't come to testify. I came to be present. The irony isn't lost on me sitting outside while she sits inside both of us in different kinds of judgment. The difference is her verdict will be public. Mine was delivered in whispers 11 years ago in family dinners where my name stopped being mentioned in Christmas photos, where I was cropped out to balance the frame. They think I walked away because I couldn't handle it. They never asked why I stopped wearing the uniform. A young Marine passes his ribbons, catching the light like small promises pinned to his chest. He glances at me, probably wondering why a civilian is sitting here looking like she belongs but doesn't quite fit. I know that feeling. I've been practicing it for over a decade. My phone buzzes. A text from my mother, "Don't make this about you." I almost laugh. After 11 years of being invisible, the idea that I could make anything about me feels like a joke, only I'm not in on. Inside that building, Jessica will sit straight-backed and composed the way our father taught us. She'll answer questions with the precision of someone who's never doubted her place in the world. And when it's over, she'll walk out in her uniform still, a Marine still, their pride. But sometimes the truth has its own schedule. Sometimes it doesn't wait for permission to speak. I fold my phone and settle back against the step, watching shadows grow longer across the parade ground. The hearing will end soon. The real reckoning is just beginning. My name is Natalie Reed, oldest daughter of the Reed bloodline Marines back 5 generations. The quiet one. The one who disappeared. If you asked my family to describe me, they'd probably pause for a moment like they're trying to remember someone they used to know. Then they'd say I was the daughter who couldn't cut it, the one who walked away from West Point after 2 years because the pressure was too much, the disappointment who now works in some vague administrative job they never quite understand. They'd tell you I was always too sensitive for military life, too soft, too prone to overthinking instead of just following orders. They wouldn't be lying exactly. They'd just be telling the story they needed to believe. The truth is messier. It always is. I am the daughter who took classified briefings at 19, who learned to read satellite imagery like other people read newspapers, who spent 3 years in logistics command coordinating supply chains that kept Marines alive in places most Americans can't pronounce. But I wasn't weak. I wasn't gone. I was just invisible, by design. There's a particular skill to being overlooked, not because you're unremarkable, but because you've learned to dim your own light so others can shine brighter. I mastered it early. In a family where excellence was currency and attention was rationed, I became the daughter who made sure everyone else had what they needed to succeed. Jessica got the spotlight. I built the stage. Our father got the respect. I filed the reports that earned it. Our mother got the peace of mind. I carried the worry she couldn't handle. For years I told myself this was enough. That being essential was better than being celebrated. That someone had to hold the foundation while others climbed higher. I was good at it. Maybe too good. When you become invisible by choice, people start to assume you were never really there to begin with. Your contributions get absorbed into the general success of the family unit. Your sacrifices become footnotes in someone else's story of triumph. And when something goes wrong, when someone needs to take the blame, well, the invisible daughter is the perfect candidate. She's already used to not being seen. Maybe this sounds familiar to you. Maybe you've ever stood behind someone and taken the bullet they didn't even know was fired. Maybe you've watched your family celebrate achievements that were built on your silence. Maybe you've sat at dinner tables where your own accomplishments were treated like background noise, while someone else's mediocre efforts got a standing ovation. If so, you'll understand why I'm sitting on these steps today. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but because sometimes the invisible person is the only one who can see clearly. And today, clarity matters more than comfort. Growing up in Oceanside, California, meant growing up in the shadow of Camp Pendleton, Our house sat 3 miles from the main gate, close enough that we could hear reveille at dawn and taps at sunset. Close enough that the rhythm of military life became our heartbeat. Master Gunnery Sergeant Charles Reed. My father was the kind of Marine other Marines talked about in hushed, respectful tones. 32 years of service, 3 deployments, 2 Bronze Stars, and a reputation for turning raw recruits into soldiers who came home alive. He carried himself like the flag was sewn into his spine. At home, he was no different. Breakfast at 0600, beds made with hospital corners, homework inspected like mission reports. Discipline wasn't punishment in our house, it was devotion. To country to core, to the Reed name that had been earning respect since my great-great-grandfather stormed the beaches at Iwo Jima. Jessica was born for this world. Even as a kid, she had that magnetic pull that made people stop and pay attention. When she walked into a room, conversations shifted toward her like she was true north on a compass. She could charm our father's colleagues, quote, military history like poetry, and somehow make following orders look like leading the charge. I was different. Precise where Jessica was bold, careful where she was confident. I memorized regulations not to impress anyone, but because knowing the rules meant understanding how systems worked. While Jessica practiced speeches in the mirror, I organized our father's medal collection by date and campaign, creating detailed catalogs that he never asked for, but always used. Natalie's my logistics expert, he'd say, when his friends came over ruffling my hair like I was a helpful pet. Never forgets a detail. Jessica got my rising star. I got reliable. When we both enlisted Jessica straight out of high school, me after 2 years of college, our paths diverged like they always had. She went into field leadership, the kind of role that put her name on mission reports and her face in unit photos. Natural fit, everyone said. Born for command. I chose logistics, supply chain management, resource allocation, the unglamorous work that happened behind closed doors, making sure Marines had ammunition when they pulled the trigger and medical supplies when they bled. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Every successful mission depended on 1,000 invisible decisions made by people whose names never appeared in after-action reports. I was good at being one of those people. I wasn't born for the spotlight, I'd tell myself during those early years, watching Jessica rise through the ranks, while I coordinated freight manifests and equipment requisitions. But I knew how to build the stage so others could stand tall. Our father was proud of both of us in his way. But pride, I learned, came in different flavors. Jessica's achievements were dinner table conversation stories he told at the VFW, accomplishments that reflected well on his legacy. Mine were acknowledgments, nods of approval when supply runs went smoothly, quiet recognition that his methodical daughter was doing exactly what everyone expected her to do. The difference was subtle but profound. Jessica was celebrated for exceeding expectations. I was appreciated for meeting them. For years I told myself this was enough, that the Corps needed both kinds of Marines, the leaders who inspired and the workers who enabled, that someone had to handle the details while others handled the glory. I believed that right up until Operation Silent Vow. Right up until I learned that being invisible made you the perfect person to disappear. 11 years ago, Operation Silent Vow was supposed to be a textbook cross-border operation in Syria. Clean insertion, targeted intelligence gathering, minimal footprint, the kind of mission that would be classified for decades and remembered only in the margins of military history. Jessica commanded a reconnaissance unit tasked with monitoring suspected weapons caches near Aleppo. I was assigned to logistics coordination from the forward operating base, ensuring supply lines stayed secure and communication protocols remained intact. For 3 weeks, everything ran by the book. Jessica's reports were precise, her unit disciplined. I coordinated resupply drops and maintained operational security with the methodical care that had become my signature. Our father, now serving as a strategic advisor at the Pentagon, had helped design the deployment framework. It was a Reed family operation in all but name. Then came the 4th week. Intelligence suggested a high-value target had taken refuge in a compound 15 kilometers outside our operational zone. Jessica received preliminary authorization to conduct surveillance, observe, and report only. No engagement without explicit command approval. But when her unit arrived, they found the compound actively being evacuated. Vehicles loaded with what appeared to be weapons containers. a narrow window of opportunity to intercept materials that could end up targeting American forces. Jessica made a command decision. She ordered an immediate sweep of the compound. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. When the smoke cleared, they had recovered significant intelligence and neutralized 3 confirmed hostiles. They had also killed 4 civilians, including 2 children who had been hiding in a storage building that wasn't supposed to be occupied. I learned about it the same way everyone else did through the initial after-action report that landed on my desk for operational review. Standard procedure for any engagement involving civilian casualties. I was supposed to verify supply expenditures, confirm communication logs, and file a routine assessment. What I found wasn't routine. Jessica's authorization for the sweep had come through an emergency protocol channel, one that required explicit approval from senior command. But when I traced the authorization chain, I discovered something that made my blood freeze. The final clearance signature belonged to my father. Except he hadn't signed it. The authorization had been processed through an automated system using his digital credential, but the timestamp showed it had been executed while he was in a Senate briefing 3,000 miles away. Someone had used his access codes to retroactively approve an operation that had already happened. Jessica's unit had gone in without proper authorization. When civilians died, someone had falsified the paperwork to make it look like they'd had permission all along. I spent 2 days cross-referencing communication logs, access records, and operational timelines. The pattern became clear. Jessica had made the call to engage, then used our father's credentials she had emergency access to, as his daughter and a senior field officer, to create authorization after the fact. If the truth came out, Jessica would face court-martial for falsifying operational orders and unauthorized engagement resulting in civilian deaths. Her career would be over. Her freedom would be in question. Worse, the investigation would reveal that our father's security protocols had been compromised through family access. His reputation, built over 3 decades of flawless service, would be destroyed by association. The Reed name would become synonymous with the kind of scandal that ended careers and tainted legacies. I had 2 options: report what I knew or carry the fault myself. I chose the path that let me sleep at night. I rewrote the operational assessment. Instead of documenting Jessica's authorization breach, I reported that the civilian casualties had resulted from faulty intelligence coordination. My responsibility as logistics lead. I cited inadequate reconnaissance data and poor communication protocols. I signed my name to failures I hadn't made. Then I submitted a formal request for disciplinary review of my own performance. The inquiry was swift and quiet. I was found to have demonstrated insufficient operational awareness, resulting in preventable civilian casualties. The reprimand went into my file, along with a recommendation for immediate reassignment to non-combat duties. 6 weeks later, I received what they called a non-punitive discharge. No formal charges, no public record, no ceremony. Just paperwork that moved me from active duty to inactive reserves, effective immediately. They let me leave quietly. Said I lacked battlefield clarity, the irony I'd never seen more clearly in my life. I saw that protecting the people you love sometimes means letting them believe you failed them. I saw that doing the right thing doesn't always feel right. And I saw that sacrifice isn't always noble, sometimes it's just necessary. Jessica never asked what happened to my career. Our father never questioned why his promising daughter suddenly disappeared from military life. They accepted my failure because it was easier than examining their own. For 11 years, I carried their secret like a stone in my chest, heavy but manageable, until today, when the weight of silence finally became too much to bear. The silence started immediately. Not the comfortable quiet of a family that understands each other, but the deliberate silence of people who've agreed never to mention the elephant in the room. My name simply stopped appearing in conversations like I was a classified operation that had been declassified out of existence. Jessica's promotion to captain came 8 months after Silent Vow. I learned about it from a newspaper clipping my mother sent, no letter, just the article folded into an envelope with my address, written in her careful script. The headline read, "Local Marine Advances Rapidly Through Ranks." The photo showed Jessica in dress blues, standing next to our father, both of them beaming. I wasn't mentioned anywhere in the article. Not as her sister, not as a fellow Marine, not even as a footnote to the Reed family legacy. It was like I had never existed. Our father's stories changed too. At VFW meetings, at Marine Corps birthday celebrations, at the retirement parties where old warriors gathered to share war stories, he spoke of Jessica with the kind of pride that made other parents jealous. Her tactical decisions, her leadership potential, her bright future in the Corps. When people asked about his other daughter because someone always remembered there had been 2 Reed girls, he'd pause for just a moment. Then he'd say something vague about how military life wasn't for everyone, how some people find different paths. The subject would shift quickly, like discussing me was somehow impolite. Christmas cards arrived at my apartment, addressed only to me. No family photos inside, no updates about what everyone was doing. Just my mother's signature and a generic holiday message, like I was a distant relative. They felt obligated to acknowledge once a year. The final erasure came 3 years after my discharge. A package arrived with no return address, just my mother's handwriting and a postmark from Oceanside. Inside was my old Marine Corps Achievement Medal, the one I'd earned for excellence in logistical coordination during my 2nd deployment. The plaque was wrapped in tissue paper, carefully protected but clearly unwanted. No note, no explanation. Just a piece of my service history returned to me like borrowed china. I understood the message. They were cleaning house, removing reminders of the daughter who had disappointed them, making room on the family wall for Jessica's growing collection of achievements. I wasn't just ignored, I was erased. From our own history wall. I kept working, building a quiet life in civilian consulting. I helped small companies streamline their supply chains using the skills the Marine Corps had taught me to solve problems for people who never asked about my military background. I was good at it. Good at being invisible, good at making other people successful, good at carrying on like the past didn't matter. But the past always matters. Every family gathering I didn't attend, every promotion announcement that arrived without my name attached, every Christmas photo that circulated among relatives with 3 Reed family members instead of 4, it all added up to a systematic deletion of my existence. They thought they had buried the truth along with my reputation. What they never knew was that someone else kept a copy of the truth, just in case. Roger Kim had been the communications specialist attached to Jessica's unit during Silent Vow. A careful, methodical Marine who documented everything and trusted nothing to memory. The kind of soldier who kept backup files, who understood that in the fog of war, the only thing you could count on was what you could prove. Roger had seen what I'd seen. He'd kept what I'd destroyed. And somewhere in a storage unit in San Diego, the real story of Operation Silent Vow waited in a manila folder patient as a loaded weapon. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing inventory reports for a client in Phoenix. My phone buzzed against the desk, a number I recognized but rarely answered anymore. My mother's voice crisp and efficient as always, like she was delivering a weather report. "Natalie, it's Jessica." No greeting, no small talk. Just straight to the point, the way our family had always handled crisis. Something about unauthorized intel routing. She continued, her tone carefully neutral. "Internal investigation. They're calling it a formal hearing, but it's probably nothing. You know how these things get blown out of proportion." I set down my pen and stared at the spreadsheet on my screen, numbers suddenly meaningless. Unauthorized intel routing. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. "The hearing is next week at Pendleton," my mother went on. "We thought maybe you should come." The pause stretched long enough for me to hear the hesitation in her voice. This wasn't an invitation. It was damage control. Show up, sit quietly, present a united family front. Don't let outsiders see the cracks in the Reed Foundation. Just, she cleared her throat. Don't make this about you. The line went quiet except for the soft sound of her breathing. 11 years of silence, and this was how she chose to break it. Not with an apology or an explanation, but with a warning. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to hang up. To let them handle their crisis the same way they'd handled mine, with careful editing and strategic forgetting. To let Jessica face whatever consequences awaited her without the complication of my presence. But another part of me, the part that still woke up some nights, remembering the weight of that falsified authorization, the part that had carried their secret like shrapnel in my chest, wanted to see how this played out. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "The hearing is Thursday at 0900, building 1133. Her voice softened just slightly. "It would mean something to your father." having the family together. After she hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, watching dust motes drift through the afternoon light, unauthorized intel routing. I wondered what Jessica had done this time, what rules she'd bent or broken in service of her rising career. I wondered if she'd used the same justifications she'd used in Syria: quick thinking, tactical necessity, the greater good. I wondered if this time there would be consequences she couldn't shift to someone else. By evening, I had made my decision, not because I wanted reconciliation or closure or any of the neat emotional resolutions that happened in movies, not because I thought showing up would change anything between us. I was going because sometimes the only way to close a chapter is to write the ending yourself. I booked a flight to San Diego and packed a single bag with civilian clothes. No uniform, no medals, no symbols of the service I'd once worn with pride. Just myself and the truth I'd been carrying for 11 years. Time to see which one of us was stronger. Building 1133 at Camp Pendleton was designed to intimidate. High ceilings, polished marble floors, and walls lined with portraits of Marines who had earned their place in history through blood and valor. The kind of room where careers were made and broken, where the weight of tradition pressed down like gravity. I arrived 20 minutes early and chose a seat in the back row, far from the family section where my parents sat, rigid and alert. My mother wore her best navy suit, the one she reserved for funerals and formal occasions. My father was in dress blues, his ribbons a colorful testament to decades of distinguished service. They had positioned themselves where everyone could see them, proud Marine families supporting their daughter through a minor administrative difficulty. They didn't look back to see if I had come. The hearing room filled slowly, brass everywhere, colonels and lieutenant colonels, their uniforms sharp enough to cut glass. Folded flags stood at attention in corners like silent sentinels. The whispered conversations carried the particular tension of military proceedings, where even small mistakes could echo through entire careers. Jessica entered precisely at 0900, flanked by her defense counsel. She wore her dress blues with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Her ribbons caught the light, each one a small promise of excellence fulfilled. She took her seat at the defendant's table without glancing toward the gallery, her posture perfect, her expression controlled. The presiding judge was Colonel Margaret Hayes, a career Marine with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen enough hearings to spot deception from across the room. She reviewed the case file with methodical precision, her voice cutting through the formal atmosphere like a blade. This hearing concerns allegations that Major Jessica Reed violated operational protocols by routing classified intelligence through unauthorized channels, potentially compromising ongoing operations in the Middle East theater. I listened as the charges were read, as witnesses testified about communication logs and security breaches. Jessica's responses were textbook perfect, respectful, precise, offering explanations that skirted the edge of plausibility without crossing into obvious fabrication. For 40 minutes it played out like a dozen similar hearings I had observed over the years. A careful dance between accusation and defense with truth, as the prize neither side was quite willing to claim. Then Colonel Hayes flipped to a different section of the file. She paused. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned a document I couldn't see from my position. The room's energy shifted like the moment before lightning strikes. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the formal proceedings. Echo 9, Operation Silent Vow. She looked up from the file, her gaze moving past Jessica to scan the gallery. "That was you." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica's face went white, but she maintained her composure. "Yes, ma'am. I was the unit commander for that operation." Colonel Hayes nodded slowly, then continued reading. Her expression darkened as she processed whatever was written on those pages. When she looked up again, her eyes found mine across the crowded room with laser precision. "And you," she said, pointing directly at me. "You signed the amended clearance sheet for VOW." The room went dead silent. Every head turned toward me like I was a magnet pulling at metal. I felt my parents' shock ripple through the air, felt Jessica's panic like heat radiating from a fire. I stood slowly, my civilian clothes suddenly feeling like armor. "Yes, ma'am. I did." Colonel Hayes leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in the course. "According to this file, you were found responsible for intelligence coordination failures that resulted in civilian casualties. You took disciplinary action and were subsequently discharged. That's correct, ma'am. But this supplemental report, she held up a different document. This suggests that the actual authorization breach came from Major Reed's unit command. You took the fall for someone else's operational failure. The room didn't breathe. Jessica gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. In the family section, my father's hand clenched into a fist, but he didn't move, didn't speak. I had spent 11 years preparing for this moment without knowing it was coming. Yes, ma'am, I did. The admission hit the room like a detonation. Whispers erupted behind me, quickly stifled by Colonel Hayes's sharp look. Jessica half rose from her chair, then sank back down as if her legs had given out. But I wasn't finished. It wasn't just her I saved, I said, my voice carrying across the sudden silence. The authorization that Major Reed used to justify the engagement came through compromised security protocols. If the investigation had continued, it would have implicated the senior officer whose credentials were used without proper authorization. I looked directly at my father, saw understanding dawn in his eyes, like a slow sunrise. He had never known that his own access codes had been used to cover Jessica's mistake. Had never realized that my disgrace had protected not just his younger daughter, but his own reputation. Colonel Hayes set down the file and studied me with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle that had taken years to complete. Ms. Reed, she said formally, this hearing is going to recess while we review these new revelations. I'm going to need you to remain available for testimony. As the room began to empty in controlled chaos, Jessica finally looked at me. Her face was a mask of confusion and dawning horror, like someone waking up from a dream to find it was actually a nightmare. Our eyes met across the distance between truth and lies, between the sister who had taken the fall and the one who had let her. For the first time in 11 years, she couldn't look away. The California sun felt brutal after the air-conditioned sterility of the hearing room. I walked toward the parking lot with measured steps, my civilian shoes silent on the asphalt, while the sound of dress blues and polished boots echoed behind me as officers dispersed in controlled confusion. I had almost reached my rental car when I heard her voice. Natalie, I turned. Jessica stood 20 feet away, still in her dress blues, but somehow diminished, like the uniform was wearing her instead of the other way around. Her ribbons caught the harsh light, each one a small accusation now that the truth had air to breathe. She approached slowly, as if I might bolt if she moved too fast. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You never told anyone? It wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in disbelief, the words of someone trying to understand a betrayal that had been disguised as loyalty. You let me take their praise, she continued, her voice starting to shake. All these years, every promotion, every commendation, every time Dad talked about his successful daughter, you just let me have it. I studied her face, looking for the sister I had once known underneath the officer she had become. I didn't let you, I said quietly. You took it. The words hit her like a physical blow. She stepped back, her hand moving instinctively toward her chest as if checking for wounds. I didn't know what you'd done. How was I supposed to know you weren't? I said. That was the point. Jessica's composure cracked then, just slightly. Her shoulders sagged as if she was finally feeling the weight of 11 years of unearned achievements. Why didn't you ever say anything? The question came out desperate, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that might save her life. All those family dinners when they talked about my career like I was some kind of military prodigy. All those times you sat there and said nothing while they acted like you'd never existed. Why didn't you tell them what really happened? I looked past her toward the base, where Marines moved with purpose between buildings that housed the machinery of America's defense. Young soldiers who believed in honor and sacrifice, and the idea that doing the right thing mattered more than personal cost. Because if they knew, I said, meeting her eyes again, he'd be ruined too. Jessica's face went blank, like she was processing information that didn't compute. What do you mean the authorization codes you used in Syria? They weren't yours. She started to speak, then stopped. I watched understanding bloom across her features like a sunrise over a battlefield. You used Dad's access credentials to authorize the engagement after the fact, I continued. When the civilian casualties needed explaining, you created a paper trail that made it look like you'd had permission all along. If the investigation had dug deeper, they would have found that a senior Pentagon advisor's security protocols had been compromised by his own daughter. Jessica opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. The truth hung between us like a loaded weapon neither of us wanted to claim. His career would have been over, I said. 32 years of distinguished service ended by a security breach that led to dead civilians. The Reed name would have been toxic. Not just yours, his. She stared at me for a long moment, her breathing shallow and quick. I could see her working through the implications, finally understanding the choice I had made, and the price I had paid to make it. So you signed your name to my mistake, she whispered. I signed my name to our family's survival. Jessica's hand trembled as she raised it to cover her mouth. For a moment she looked like the little sister who used to follow me around the base, asking endless questions about everything from aircraft to artillery. I never asked you to. You didn't have to. I turned toward my car, done with explanations that wouldn't change anything. Behind me, I heard her voice one more time, broken and small. Natalie, wait. But I didn't stop. Some conversations end not because everything has been said, but because nothing left to say will matter. I got in my car and drove away, leaving her standing in the parking lot of Camp Pendleton, finally alone, with the weight of her own choices. The guest quarters at Camp Pendleton were designed for temporary stays, sparse, functional, forgettable. A bed with military crisp sheets, a desk that had seen 1,000 brief visits, and a window that looked out onto the parade ground, where Marines practiced the precision that would keep them alive in places where precision mattered. I dropped my keys on the nightstand and kicked off my shoes, feeling the weight of the day settle into my bones. The hearing had been recessed indefinitely, while Colonel Hayes reviewed what she was now calling significant new evidence. My parents had left without speaking to me. Jessica had disappeared into whatever meeting rooms housed officers whose careers hung in the balance. I was alone, which was exactly how I preferred it. That's when I noticed the envelope. It sat in the center of the desk, like it had always belonged there, unmarked manila. The kind of bureaucratic package that could contain anything from routine paperwork to career-ending revelations. No postmark, no return address, just my name written in block letters across the front. Inside was a single document, a scanned PDF of a post-operation report dated 11 years ago. The header read, Operation Silent Vow, After Action Assessment, in the bold typeface reserved for classified materials that could reshape history. But this wasn't the sanitized version I had filed all those years ago, the one that had painted my logistical coordination as the source of the civilian casualties. This was the original, the one I had written in the immediate aftermath of the Syria engagement before I understood what my honesty would cost. My name was typed at the bottom as the reporting officer, but the content told a different story than the one that had ended my career. Unit Commander Reed J. initiated engagement without proper authorization protocol. Civilian casualties resulted from unauthorized sweep of compound outside designated operational zone. Authorization codes used post-engagement appear to have been accessed through senior command credentials without proper clearance chain. I read it twice, my hands steady, despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. This was the truth. I had buried the evidence I had destroyed to protect my family's reputation. Except I hadn't destroyed it. Someone else had kept a copy. At the bottom of the page in handwriting I recognized was a simple note, "Thought you might need this. R.K. Roger Kim." The memory hit me like a flashback in a war movie, sudden and vivid and impossible to ignore. Roger had been the communications specialist attached to Jessica's unit during Silent Vow. Quiet, methodical, the kind of Marine who documented everything and trusted nothing to memory alone. He had a reputation for keeping backup files of backup files, for understanding that in the fog of war, the only thing you could count on was what you could prove. But more than that, Roger owed me his life. During the third week of the operation, his convoy had hit an improvised explosive device 20 kilometers outside our forward operating base. The blast had destroyed 2 vehicles and left Roger trapped in an overturned Humvee with a compound fracture and internal bleeding. Standard protocol called for medical evacuation to the nearest forward aid station, a 40-minute flight that Roger didn't have time for. I had made a different call. I redirected a supply helicopter that was already in the air, loaded it with a field medic and emergency surgical supplies, and had them land directly at the blast site. The medic stabilized Roger in the field. The helicopter flew him straight to a trauma center in Germany, and he survived with nothing more than scars and a slight limp. The decision had been outside my authority. I had risked disciplinary action to save one Marine's life. Roger had never forgotten. Now, looking at the document in my hands, I understood what had really happened 11 years ago. Jessica hadn't just buried the truth about Silent Vow. She had tried to delete it entirely, scrubbing the digital archives to ensure that her version of events was the only one that survived. But Roger had kept a copy, hidden away like insurance against the day when the truth might matter more than career advancement. Someone had known all along. Someone had been watching, waiting, keeping the evidence safe. And today, when the truth finally had a chance to breathe, he had made sure it reached the one person who could give it voice. I stared at Roger's document for 20 minutes before my training kicked in. 11 years in civilian consulting had taught me that the story you're told is rarely the complete story. The truth lives in metadata, in digital fingerprints, in the electronic breadcrumbs that people leave behind when they think no one is watching. I opened my laptop and began to dig. The PDF Roger had provided contained more than just the scanned report. Embedded in the file properties was information about when it had been created, when it had been accessed, and when someone had tried to delete it from the original server. What I found made my blood run cold. The deletion attempt had been logged 6 years ago. Not 11 years ago when the original incident happened, but 6 years ago when Jessica was being considered for promotion to lieutenant colonel. Someone had accessed the classified archives and specifically targeted my original Silent Vow report for permanent removal. The access log showed a user ID I recognized, Jareed Maji. Jessica hadn't just stayed quiet about what really happened in Syria. She had actively worked to erase my version of events from the official record. I cross-referenced the deletion timestamp with Jessica's career timeline. The attempt had been made 3 days before her promotion review board convened. 3 days before she received the rank advancement that had elevated her to the upper echelons of Marine leadership. But the deletion hadn't been successful. Roger's backup had been stored on a different server, one that wasn't connected to the main archives, the electronic equivalent of keeping a safety deposit box in a different state. I pulled up more files following digital threads that led deeper into the rabbit hole. What I discovered was a pattern of careful manipulation spanning 6 years. Every time Jessica faced a career milestone, promotion reviews, command assignments, selection for advanced training, she had accessed the archives to ensure that any record of Silent Vow remained sanitized. She hadn't just covered up her mistake once. She had managed the cover-up like an ongoing operation. It wasn't guilt. It was strategy. She didn't just survive the lie, she managed it. The scope of what she had done began to crystallize. Jessica had used her security clearance and administrative access to systematically scrub any record that might contradict the official narrative. She had monitored the digital archives like a guardian, making sure that the truth stayed buried, while she climbed the ranks on the foundation of my sacrifice. I found evidence of 7 separate access attempts over the years, each one coinciding with a career advancement, each one targeting the same classified files, each one ensuring that Major Jessica Reed remained the decorated officer who had distinguished herself in Syria, while her sister remained the logistics failure who had been quietly discharged for incompetence. The most damning evidence came from an automated backup log that had been forgotten in a server migration. It showed that Jessica had not only tried to delete my original report, but had also attempted to modify the official casualty assessment to remove any reference to unauthorized engagement protocols. She had been rewriting history in real time, editing the official record to match the lie I had helped create. But there was something else in the metadata, something that made my chest tighten with a mixture of rage and grudging respect for the thoroughness of her deception. Jessica had also accessed my personnel file multiple times. She had been monitoring my civilian career, tracking my consulting work, making sure I remained invisible and unthreatening. The daughter who had disappeared from family photos had also been under digital surveillance, watched by the sister whose career depended on her continued silence. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the evidence scattered across my laptop screen. For 11 years, I had carried the weight of a decision I thought I had made to protect my family. But Jessica hadn't just accepted my protection, she had weaponized it. The truth was more complex than I had imagined. I hadn't just taken the fall for a moment of poor judgment. I had enabled a systematic campaign of historical revision that had allowed Jessica to build her entire career on a foundation of lies. And tomorrow, when the hearing reconvened, I would have to decide what to do with that knowledge. The question wasn't whether I could prove what she had done. The question was whether I was ready to burn down everything she had built. I sent 3 text messages the next morning. Simple, identical invitations to my parents and Jessica. Dinner tonight. 6 p.m., Oceanside Pier Restaurant. We need to talk. No explanations, no negotiations. Just a time and place where the Reed family would finally sit down together and deal with the truth. I arrived early and chose a table on the restaurant's deck overlooking the Pacific. The setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and indifferent to the human drama about to unfold. I ordered a bottle of wine and 3 glasses, then sat back to watch my family arrive, like actors approaching a stage they hadn't rehearsed for. My mother came first, precise and punctual as always. She wore a conservative blouse and carried her purse like a shield. My father followed 5 minutes later, still moving with the measured stride of a career Marine, even in civilian clothes. Jessica was last, her face pale but determined, like someone walking to their own court-martial. They took their seats with the careful politeness of strangers, each one waiting for someone else to explain why we were here. I didn't make them wait long. Without preamble, I slid a manila folder to the center of the table. It contained everything: Roger's original report, the metadata showing Jessica's deletion attempts, the access logs documenting 6 years of systematic cover-up. "This is the truth," I said quietly. "Not for pity, not for forgiveness. Just so no one can pretend not to know anymore." My father opened the folder first. His hand, steady enough to field-strip a rifle in the dark, trembled slightly as he turned the pages. I watched his face change as he read confusion, giving way to understanding, giving way to something that looked like grief. My mother leaned over to see what had captured his attention so completely. Her sharp intake of breath cut through the sound of waves below us. Jessica sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she could will herself to disappear into the sunset. When my father finished reading, he set the papers down with the careful precision of someone handling unexploded ordnance. He stared at the documents for a long moment, then looked up at me. His eyes, the same eyes that had commanded respect from Marines across 3 decades, couldn't quite meet mine. "The authorization codes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She used my access," I nodded. "Emergency family override. Daughter of a senior Pentagon advisor accessing her father's credentials during an active operation." He closed his eyes, finally understanding the full scope of what had happened 11 years ago. When he opened them again, there was something broken in his expression. "You didn't just protect her," he said, each word falling like a stone into still water. "You protected me." The admission hung between us like smoke from a distant fire. My mother's hand moved to cover her mouth. Jessica finally turned away from the horizon to stare at her father with something that might have been shock. "I didn't do it for you," I said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in years. "I did it because someone had to stand between the fire and the name." My father's shoulders sagged, as if he was finally feeling the weight of rank he had carried for so long. "All these years," he whispered, "we let you disappear. We let them erase you." "You didn't let anything happen," I replied. "You chose not to ask questions that might have uncomfortable answers." The truth settled over our table like fog, rolling in from the ocean, thick and inescapable, and changing everything it touched. The reconvened hearing drew a larger crowd than the first session. Word had spread through the base's informal networks, the way military gossip always did, quickly, quietly, and with the kind of anticipation that came when careers hung in the balance. I took the same seat in the back row, watching as officers filed in with the measured precision of people who understood that today's proceedings would become tomorrow's cautionary tale. The family section remained notably empty. My parents had chosen not to attend. Some truths I realized were easier to face in private. Jessica entered with her defense counsel, but something had changed in her bearing. The confident stride was gone, replaced by the careful steps of someone walking on uncertain ground. She wore her dress blues, but the uniform seemed to hang differently on her shoulders, as if the weight of truth had altered her very posture. Colonel Hayes called the hearing to order with the same crisp authority she had displayed 3 days earlier. But there was a different energy in the room now, the electric tension of a storm that was about to break. This tribunal has reviewed additional evidence pertaining to Major Reed's conduct during Operation Silent Vow, as well as subsequent actions taken to conceal material facts from official records. Jessica stood when called upon, her hands clasped behind her back in the position of attention that had been drilled into her since boot camp. Major Reed, do you wish to make a statement before this tribunal renders its decision? Yes, ma'am. Jessica's voice carried across the silent room with the clarity of someone who had finally decided to stop running from the truth. 11 years ago, I made a tactical decision that resulted in civilian casualties. When faced with the consequences of that decision, I allowed my sister to accept responsibility for my actions. She took a formal reprimand and ended her military career to protect mine. The room remained absolutely still. Even the usual shuffle of papers and quiet coughs had stopped. But my sister's sacrifice wasn't enough for me, Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger. Over the following years, I used my security clearance to systematically remove evidence of my original mistake from official records. I monitored classified archives to ensure that the truth remained buried while I advanced through the ranks. Colonel Hayes leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. My sister carried what I couldn't. Jessica said, her gaze finding mine across the crowded room. And I kept quiet for the wrong reasons. Not out of shame or gratitude, but because I had built my entire career on the foundation of her silence. She paused, taking a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. I accept full responsibility for my actions, both past and present. I formally request that this tribunal remove me from promotion eligibility and enter a letter of reprimand in my permanent record. The hearing concluded with the efficient brutality of military justice. Jessica received exactly what she had requested, a formal reprimand that would effectively end her advancement prospects and immediate reassignment to administrative duties pending further review. As the room emptied, Jessica approached my seat in the back row. She stopped a respectful distance away, her hands still clasped behind her back. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me, she said quietly. I don't think I deserve that. I studied her face, looking for the confident officer who had walked into this room 3 days ago. She was gone, replaced by someone who looked smaller, but somehow more real. You're right, I said. You don't. She nodded, accepting the judgment without flinching. But something in her expression suggested that this wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about finally telling the truth, regardless of the cost. I nodded back. Not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. Recognition that some debts can only be paid with honesty, even when it comes 11 years too late. 3 months after the tribunal, I returned to my consulting work with a new client in Denver. The same spreadsheets, the same supply chain optimizations, the same quiet satisfaction of making complex systems run smoothly behind the scenes. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. The difference was a phone call I received on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Ms. Reed. This is Colonel Hayes from Camp Pendleton. I have an unusual request. She wanted me to teach a monthly seminar for mid-level officers on what she called strategic failure ethics case studies, in how good people make bad decisions under pressure and how organizations can create systems that encourage truth-telling instead of cover-ups. We need voices that understand the real cost of institutional silence, she said. People who've lived through what happens when protecting careers becomes more important than protecting integrity. I accepted, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe because some lessons are too important to keep locked away in personal experience. Maybe because the Marine Corps that had shaped me deserved better than the culture of silence that had nearly destroyed my family. The seminars were held in a small classroom in Building 1133, the same complex where Jessica's hearing had taken place. 15 to 20 officers each session, mostly majors and lieutenant colonels, facing their own moral crossroads in an increasingly complex world. I taught them about decision trees and ethical frameworks, about the difference between loyalty and complicity, about how the pressure to protect institutional reputation could corrupt individual judgment. But mostly I taught them that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth even when it hurts the people you love. Jessica attended every session. She sat in the back row, never raised her hand, never participated in discussions, just listened with the focused attention of someone learning a language she should have mastered years ago. The other officers didn't know who she was, just another field-grade officer attending professional development training. After each seminar, she would file out with the others without speaking to me. A polite nod, nothing more. I respected the boundary she had created. Some relationships can't be rebuilt, only redefined. Then after the sixth session, I found a folded piece of paper on my desk. No name, no signature, just a single line, written in Jessica's careful script. You didn't just hold the line, you were the line. I stared at the note for a long time, trying to decide what it meant and whether it mattered. It wasn't an apology. We had moved beyond apologies into territory where words carried different weight. It was recognition, maybe. Acknowledgement of something that had taken 11 years to understand. I folded the note and put it in my briefcase next to the original silent vow documents that Roger had preserved. Evidence of choices made and prices paid of sisters who had learned to carry truth differently. The next month, Jessica returned to her seat in the back row. We didn't speak, but something had shifted in the careful distance between us. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but something quieter and more durable. Understanding. 6 months later, I found myself walking the bluffs overlooking Camp Pendleton at sunset. The Pacific stretched endlessly westward, indifferent to the human stories playing out on the cliffs above. Below me, the bass hummed with its eternal rhythm. Marines, training, learning, becoming the kind of people who would carry impossible burdens in impossible places. I pulled my mother's old ring from my pocket, the one she had worn during her years as a combat medic. She had mailed it to me 2 weeks after our dinner by the pier, with a note that simply said, "This belongs with you now." The silver was tarnished, the small sapphire clouded with age, but it felt solid and real in my palm. For the first time in my life, I slipped it onto my finger. They called me a failure, but failure doesn't sit this still, doesn't burn this steady. Failure doesn't teach ethics to Marines who will face their own moral crossroads in places where the right choice might cost everything. I didn't need medals, I didn't need my name on building plaques or my photo in promotion announcements. I just needed them to stop pretending I didn't exist. The ring caught the last light of the California sun, a small promise that some things endure even when they're forgotten. Some truths survive even when they're buried. Some people remain standing even when they've been written out of the story. I turned toward the camera of memory, toward everyone who might understand what it means to carry someone else's silence. If you've ever carried someone else's silence, drop a comment. Let me know you're still standing. Sometimes it helps to know we're not invisible. Sometimes it helps to know that the line we held was real, even when no one else could see it. Sometimes that's enough.